The Jefferson County Courthouse was packed that morning. The case to be tried was not particularly famous, but the tension in the air was evident. Judge Theodore Lancaster, known for his rigid posture and his intolerance of what he called lawlessness, entered the courtroom with his usual stern countenance. He adjusted his black robe, straightened his reading glasses, and looked around. The lawyers were in place, the jury was waiting patiently, and the bailiffs were keeping order. That's when he noticed a sloppy-looking young man sitting in the dock. He was wearing a worn-out sweatshirt, ripped jeans, and cheap sneakers, clearly out of place in an environment where impeccable suits and shiny shoes were the norm. His hair was messy, and his gaze was one of pure indifference. The judge narrowed his eyes. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with gray hair and an arrogant posture, smiled and crossed his arms. This young man was held in contempt in another court and will now answer for his actions. The judge looked at the young man and grimaced. Name. The boy yawned, showing boredom. Michael Carter. The name meant nothing to him, but the young man's attitude irritated him deeply. Mr. Carter, do you realize where you are? The judge's voice sounded cold, calculated. Michael looked up with an expression that didn't concern him in the slightest. A courtroom. The room fell silent. A few people in the audience held back discreet giggles, but the judge's murderous stare quickly silenced them, said the judge, his voice taking on a harsher tone. Do you think this is a game? Michael Carter shrugged. For some, maybe it is. Judge Lancaster slammed his gavel down hard. Bring him in. Two bailiffs approached and grabbed Michael by the arms, bringing him into the center of the courtroom. Do you think you can make a mockery of the judicial system? Continued the judge, his anger visible. People like you represent everything that is wrong with our society. Young people who don't respect the law, who think they can do whatever they want without consequences. Michael kept his gaze fixed on the judge, unblinking. Your Honor, if I may. I won't. It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. The judge got out of his chair and came down from the pulpit. Murmurs filled the courtroom as he approached Michael with firm steps. Do you think you can defy the court, boy? Michael still showed no reaction. It was then that, without warning, Judge Lancaster threw a dry punch at Michael's stomach. The impact made the young man bend over for a moment, but he didn't fall. The courtroom was filled with absolute shock. The bailiffs were paralyzed. The prosecutor, "Swallow dry, Your Honor," shouted one of the defense lawyers, but the judge didn't stop. He grabbed Michael by the collar and pushed him against the defendant's bench. Now you'll see how justice really works. Michael coughed, trying to catch his breath. He slowly raised his head and looked straight into the judge's eyes. And then he laughed. The laugh was low at first, but soon turned into a loud, provocative laugh. The whole room was stunned. You've just made the biggest mistake of your life. Michael Carter straightened his posture, snapped his fingers, and pulled a badge from his sweatshirt pocket. He held it up in the air for everyone to see. The badge read, Michael Carter, Criminalist Lawyer, United States Bar Association. The silence was broken by a shout from the prosecutor. What Judge Lancaster felt the blood drain from his face. Michael smiled. Surprised, the courtroom erupted into an uproar. Michael put the badge away and straightened his posture. Your Honor, allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Michael Carter, a criminal lawyer and specialist in abuses of the justice system. I've spent the last few months studying your cases and following your extremely punitive sentences for low-income youths. The judge took a step back. Michael continued. So I decided to test something. If a judge was willing to use force against someone he believes to be an unimportant defendant, what else would he be able to do? The judge tried to speak, but Michael held up his hand. Before you try to justify yourself, let me inform you that everything was recorded. He pointed to a woman sitting in the front rows of the audience. My assistant Julia was broadcasting everything live. At this very moment, the whole country is watching a judge raping a citizen for no reason. The judge's face turned as red as a tomato. Yes, and now you're going to be tried for it. The courtroom turned into absolute chaos. Officers from the Judicial Review, who were already in the room to monitor the case, immediately stood up and approached the judge. Your Honor, you are under arrest for assault and abuse of power, said one of them. Judge Lancaster turned completely pale. He provoked me. The law doesn't care about provocation, replied Michael, his tone calm. If any man had done that, he'd be in prison right now. The officers placed handcuffs on Judge Lancaster in front of the entire court. The hearing, which began as a trial of an allegedly disrespectful defendant, ended with a corrupt judge being exposed to the whole country. As Lancaster was led away by the officers, Michael smiled at the prosecutor. "Do you still want to continue with this ridiculous accusation against me?" The prosecutor, trembling, just shook his head and asked for the case to be closed. Michael Carter won, and now the whole system knew who he was. The whole country was in shock. In a matter of minutes, the video of Judge Lancaster's assault was already circulating on social networks, news programs, and talk shows. Jurists, journalists, and even politicians began to comment on the case, calling what had happened one of the biggest judicial scandals of recent years. Michael Carter, until then unknown to the general public, became the most talked about name of the day. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The repercussions explode. The next day, headlines appeared everywhere. Violent judge assaults undercover. Lawyer and is arrested in court. Michael Carter, the lawyer who cheated the system and unmasked a corrupt judge. The end of the Lancaster-era investigation expands to review judges' rulings. The Justice Department immediately suspended Lancaster from his duties and opened an investigation into his conduct in other cases. Many lawyers began reviewing old cases, and what they found was shocking. Judge Lancaster had a history of absurdly harsh rulings against young Black and Latino men. Michael knew it wasn't enough just to expose him. Now he had to make sure that he would never return to office. The judge's interrogation. 3 days after his arrest, Lancaster was called to testify. Michael was present, but this time as part of the prosecution. The judge, now without his robe, without the power and respect he once enjoyed, looked like a defeated man. He was wearing a cheap suit, had deep dark circles under his eyes, and his hands were shaking as he adjusted his tie. The prosecutor in charge of the case began to question him. "Your Honor, or rather Mr. Lancaster, do you confirm that you assaulted an individual inside the courtroom?" The former judge frowned. I was provoked." Michael smiled discreetly. "Do you believe that being provoked justifies the use of force?" Lancaster hesitated. He knew that any answer could condemn him even more. "I made an error of judgment," he muttered. The prosecutor picked up a pile of documents and threw them on the table. "Let's talk about your other errors of judgment, Mr. Lancaster. In your career, you've convicted 85% more young Blacks and Latinos than whites for identical crimes. How do you explain this discrepancy?" The former judge paled. Michael crossed his arms, watching him sink in front of his own dirty past. Lancaster shouted. "I followed the law." Michael drummed his fingers on the table. "If you followed the law, then why did you forge evidence to keep innocent people in prison?" The courtroom gulped. The former judge turned pale as a ghost. I never did that." Michael took out a dossier and opened it in front of everyone. "Here are 3 cases in which you accepted evidence that had clearly been tampered with by prosecutors. People were wrongly imprisoned, and guess what? They were all Black or Latino." The judge lost control. "This is a circus." The prosecutor turned to Michael. "Mr. Carter, what do you suggest for this case?" Michael didn't hesitate. "Lancaster should be formally tried and convicted of abuse of power and judicial fraud. In addition, all cases in which he participated should be reviewed immediately." The room erupted in murmurs. The prosecutor looked at the presiding judge. "Your Honor, formal charges will be filed in 48 hours. The judge banged his gavel. "Proceed." Theodore Lancaster was officially destroyed. The national unfolding. The case became a watershed. Lancaster's imprisonment opened the door to the review of hundreds of unfair trials. Many of the young people he convicted finally had their sentences re-evaluated and reversed. Michael was asked to take part in a national commission to discuss reforms to the justice system. "I just wanted to show how the system treats people without power," he said in an interview. "But now I realize that I have to do much more." The final confrontation. Months later, Lancaster was in a different courtroom, this time as a defendant. Michael was sitting in the audience, watching everything carefully. When it was time for the judge to pass sentence, Lancaster stood up, visibly shaken. "You destroyed me, Carter," he said, casting a hateful glance at Michael. Michael leaned forward and smiled slightly. "No, Judge." The judge banged her gavel. "The defendant is sentenced to 15 years in prison for abuse of power, assault, and judicial fraud." The courtroom erupted in hubbub. Michael watched as Lancaster was handcuffed and led away by the officers. The cycle was complete. What came next? After Lancaster's fall, the system began to change. Judicial reforms advanced, and more cases of wrongful convictions were overturned. Michael Carter became one of the most respected lawyers in the country. "You fooled everyone by pretending to be a criminal," a journalist told him. Michael laughed. "I only fooled those who wanted to see a criminal." When asked what his next move would be, he simply replied, "There are still many like Lancaster out there." And so Michael Carter continued his mission, ensuring that justice belonged to everyone, not just the powerful. The Lancaster case was just the first of many. Michael Carter knew that the fall of that judge was not the end of the fight against corruption in the justice system, but just the first piece of the domino falling. Now he was a target. The people who held power knew who he was, they knew what he was capable of, and they would do anything to stop him from continuing to expose the flaws in the system. The rise of a greater enemy. Few months after Lancaster's conviction, Michael received an anonymous phone call. "You have no idea what you've started, kid. If you keep poking around in this hornet's nest, you won't live to see what comes next." Michael recognized empty threats when he heard them. First, the media started receiving fake dossiers trying to smear his name. Allegations that he had fabricated evidence against Lancaster, that his career was based on manipulation, and that he was involved in illegal financing schemes. Then he realized he was being followed. Strange cars prowled around his house at night. His phone started having strange faults as if it was being tapped. "Michael, this is getting dangerous," said Julia, his assistant. But he wasn't going to stop. If someone was trying to scare him, it was because he was close to something big. And that's when he discovered the real enemy. His System Strikes Back Michael began investigating the most high-profile cases in the Lancaster court and discovered a pattern. There was a network of judges, prosecutors, and even police officers working together, ensuring that certain sentences were manipulated. It was a billion-dollar corruption scheme in which magistrates received bribes to keep incarceration rates high, favoring corporations that profited from private prisons. And at the top of this pyramid was one man, Senator Richard Callaway, an influential politician who had been working behind the scenes for years to keep the judicial system operating in a corrupt manner. And now Michael was in his way. The counterattack. When Callaway realized that Michael had discovered his name, he counterattacked. The next morning, Michael was arrested. The police raided his office, confiscated documents, and claimed that he had tampered with evidence in the Lancaster case. The news started calling him the criminal lawyer, saying that he wasn't a hero of justice but a dangerous manipulator. He was handcuffed and thrown into a cell, but he wasn't surprised. He knew that Callaway would do something like this. What he didn't expect was what would happen next, the return of an old enemy. While he was waiting in the cell, he heard footsteps in the corridor. A guard opened the door, and a man entered. Michael raised his head and was shocked. It was Theodore Lancaster. The former judge, who should have been serving time, was now standing there free, wearing an impeccable suit with a victorious smile on his face. Surprised to see me, Carter Michael didn't answer. "Oh, don't worry," Lancaster continued. "I'm still officially serving time. But when you have powerful friends, let's just say that certain rules don't apply." Michael grinned. "Callaway brought you back, didn't he?" Lancaster laughed. "You think you brought down the system. You don't understand anything, kid. You've only disturbed the surface." Michael crossed his arms. "Are you here to intimidate me? Because if so, you can leave." Lancaster leaned forward. "I'm here to give you a warning. Give it up." Michael didn't blink. "And if I don't?" The judge sighed. "Then it'll be the end of you." He turned to leave, but before he crossed the threshold, he stopped and said, "And Carter, it's good to be careful who you trust." The cell was locked again. Michael knew at that moment that something much bigger was about to happen. The rescue a few hours later, Julia got bail to release him. When Michael left the police station, the whole city was waiting. Reporters, cameras, activists, demonstrators for and against him. He climbed into a car and grabbed a microphone. "You want to know if I'm a criminal?" he said. He said, "Then listen carefully." Silence fell over the crowd. "I was arrested because I exposed a corrupt judge. Now they're trying to shut me up because I've discovered something even bigger. This country is being controlled by a dirty justice system manipulated by people who use the law as a weapon to get rich." He paused and looked at the cameras. "And I won't stop." The crowd erupted in applause. Michael knew that he was now officially at war with the system, but he wasn't alone. The revolution begins in the following days. New accusations began to emerge. More lawyers joined Michael. The press began to investigate Calloway's scheme. The Senate was pressured to open a CPI. Calloway tried to hush up the situation, but it was too late. Michael Carter had become the corrupt system's biggest nightmare. But he knew that the fight was only just beginning, and that the real final blow was yet to come. The attack on Michael Carter, Michael's popularity was growing by the day. His story was in every newspaper, TV program, and political debate. Ordinary. People began to demonstrate in the streets, demanding deeper investigations into the justice system. Senator Richard Calloway and his allies were surrounded, but not defeated. And when a corrupt system is cornered, it attacks. That night, Michael was in his apartment reviewing documents when the doorbell rang. Julia, his assistant and faithful ally, was on the phone with him at that moment. "I'm not expecting anyone," said Michael. "Don't open it," warned Julia. "It could be a trap." Michael took out his cell phone and activated the security monitor. The door camera showed a uniformed delivery man holding a box. His instinct told him something was wrong. He picked up the phone and called his private security guard. "I need a sweep of the area now." But before he could do anything, the door was kicked in. 5 hooded men burst into the apartment dressed in black, with stun guns and masks. Michael reacted quickly. He pulled out a chair and threw it at the first intruder. He then tried to run to the back exit, but was grabbed by 2 men and pinned to the ground. "No more games, Carter," said one of the men. Michael tried to struggle but felt an electric shock run through his body. His vision blurred. He heard Julia screaming into the phone before everything went dark. The disappearance of Michael Carter. Next morning, the news was filled with a single headline: "Michael Carter disappears, authorities seek answers." Social networks exploded. Where was the lawyer who had defied the system? Desperate, Julia went to the Carter Foundation office and called a press conference. "Michael Carter hasn't disappeared," she said. "He's been kidnapped." "By whom?" a reporter shouted. Julia faced the cameras. "You already know the answer." The streets were filled with protests. Hundreds of people demanded answers. Human rights organizations called for the FBI to take over the case. But Calloway and his allies remained silent. And meanwhile, Michael wakes up in captivity. Michael opened his eyes slowly. His head ached, and his body felt heavy. He tried to move, but his hands were tied to a chair. He was in a dark, damp shed with metal walls and only one light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The sound of footsteps echoed through the place, and then he saw him. Senator Calloway. The man smiled and crossed his arms. "Welcome to the end of the line, Carter." Michael took a deep breath, analyzing the situation. "Are you sure about this, Calloway? Because if I'm alive, it means you're scared." The senator laughed. "You were always smart, kid, but not smart enough." Michael kept his posture firm. "What's the plan? Kill me, I assure you. That will only make my name a bigger symbol than it already is." Calloway shook his head. "You're not worth any more dead." "But you know what is? You're discredited." Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" The senator picked up a folder and threw it on the table next to Michael. "This is evidence that you took bribes, rigged trials, and are involved with criminal organizations." Michael laughed. "I know they're fake." "Of course they are," said Calloway, "but it's not the truth that matters. It's what people believe." Michael gulped. "You want to turn me into the villain." Calloway smiled. "Exactly." And then Michael realized the real plan. He wouldn't be killed. He would be publicly destroyed. And worst of all, they could pull it off. Julia's counterattack and the turnaround. While Calloway put his plan into action, Julia didn't stand idly by. She knew that Michael couldn't have simply disappeared without a trace. With the help of activists and independent journalists, She began tracking the suspicious movements of the senator's allies. That's how she discovered an abandoned shed in an industrial area of the city. Wasting no time, she called the FBI. That night, special forces raided the place. The kidnappers were neutralized, and Calloway tried to escape but was intercepted. Michael was found alive, tied up, but unharmed. When he came out of captivity and saw Julia waiting outside, he smiled. "You're brilliant." "I know," she said. Calloway's downfall. Michael's kidnapping was Calloway's fatal mistake. The FBI found compromising recordings inside the shed, revealing all his conspiracies, threats, and crimes. He was arrested the same day. And so the most powerful man in judicial corruption fell before the eyes of the entire country, Michael Carter. The name that changed everything after his release. Michael didn't rest. He knew the war wasn't over, but now he had the world's attention. The judicial systems began to undergo historic reforms. Corrupt judges were investigated, unjust convictions were overturned, and for the first time, the people felt that justice didn't just belong to the powerful. In one of his most famous interviews, Michael was asked, "After all this, are you afraid?" He smiled and replied, "I'm afraid of a world where no one fights." The journalist continued, "What's your next step?" Michael Carter looked at the camera and said, "Justice is not a destination, it's an eternal struggle." The world listened and the revolution continued. The new threat, the Calloway case, marked a watershed in the fight against corruption in the justice system. For the first time in decades, corrupt judges, prosecutors, and politicians were being exposed, jailed, and removed from office. Michael Carter's name became synonymous with courage and ruthless justice, but he knew that the higher he climbed, the more dangerous his enemies became. And the proof came 3 months after Calloway's arrest. Michael was in a meeting with his team when Julia rushed into the room, pale and panting. "You need to see this," she said, throwing a tablet onto the table. He picked it up, and the blood drained from his face. It was a dossier full of false information, alleging that he had used his position to profit from court settlements and manipulate cases in his favor. The con was clear: if they couldn't silence him physically, they would try to destroy his credibility. "That's false," said Michael. "We know," replied Julia. "But the public? The public has already begun to doubt. The persecution increases." In the following days, the attacks came from all sides. Conservative politicians demanded investigations against Michael. TV presenters started calling him a fake hero. Former allies began to distance themselves, fearing that they would be implicated in the fabricated scandal. Michael realized what was happening. "This is a bigger plan," he told Julia. "Whoever is behind this, it's someone who was waiting for Calloway's downfall to take control." And he was right, because a new enemy emerged from the shadows. The rise of Marshall Drake with Calloway out of the game, a new name took its place on the political and judicial scene. Marshall Drake, a billionaire lawyer and former senator, took on the role of defender of order, publicly attacking Michael at every opportunity. "The people need to know the truth," Drake said on a TV show. "Michael Carter is not a hero. Drake had influence money and powerful allies in the system. Unlike Calloway, he didn't have to operate in the shadows. He was the system." And Michael realized that he was up against an even more dangerous enemy. The attempt to assassinate Michael, the threats intensified. One day, while driving to a charity event, Michael was attacked. His car was intercepted by a black SUV, which forced him off the road. The vehicle overturned twice before coming to a stop on the roadside. Luckily, Michael survived with minor injuries, but when forensics examined the car, they found that the brakes had been sabotaged. Julia visited him in hospital. That was a death sentence. Michael stared at the ceiling, taking a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. If before he was just fighting the system, now he had to bring it down completely. And to do that, he needed to find something that could destroy Marshall Drake once and for all. The discovery that would change everything. Michael and his team began to investigate Marshall Drake's past. They combed through old files, financial transactions, suspicious contracts, and then they found what they needed. Marshall Drake was involved in a scheme to launder money through the private prison system. Billions of dollars had passed through the hands of judges, prosecutors, and politicians to keep people locked up and ensure that the private prisons made a profit. What's more, he was directly linked to the conviction of hundreds of innocent people. Michael Carter finally had the weapon he needed to bring down his greatest enemy. The final showdown. The night the indictment was published, Marshal Drake called an emergency press conference. Michael and Julia were in the audience. The atmosphere was tense. Drake took to the stage and smiled at the cameras, trying to look calm. "The country is being deceived," he said. "Michael Carter is a dangerous man, and everything he says is nothing but lies and manipulation." Michael stood up and held a flash drive in front of the crowd. "Then let's let the audience decide." He plugged the flash drive into the auditorium's computer, and a video started playing on the giant screen. It was a secret recording of Drake talking to corrupt judges, discussing how to keep prisons full to increase profits. The whole country watched shocked. Drake paled. That's manipulation." Michael just smiled. "The only manipulation here is what you've done for years. But now the game is over." The audience erupted in screams. The FBI stormed the scene and arrested Marshal Drake live in front of the entire country. It was the end of an empire of corruption, and Michael Carter had finally won. What comes next? With Drake's fall, the system began to undergo the greatest judicial reform in history. Michael became one of the most important voices of justice in the United States. He turned down invitations to political office, saying, "I don't want power, I want justice." Julia became the director of the new National Anti-Corruption Commission, and the fight continued because, as Michael always said, justice doesn't sleep. And so Michael Carter continued his mission, knowing that the work would never end, but that he would never give up. The new battle begins with the fall of Marshal Drake. Michael Carter thought he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The system was crumbling before his eyes. Corrupt judges were being removed. Investigations were spreading across the country, and for the first time, it seemed that justice was winning. Days after Drake's arrest, Congress received a new bill that could destroy everything Michael had fought for. The bill, dubbed the Order and Discipline Act, would give more power to judges and prosecutors, hinder investigations into judicial corruption, and expand control of private prisons. It was a dirty trick the system was trying to get back on its feet, and Michael couldn't allow it. Marshal Drake's last ally. Behind this bill was a name Michael didn't expect to find: Senator William Graves. Graves was a dangerous man, a veteran of politics who had been working behind the scenes for decades. He had never been directly linked to corruption, but now that Drake was out of the game, he emerged as the new leader of the movement to restore the old system. In a speech on the Senate floor, Graves said, "What is happening in our country is an attack on our institutions. Michael Carter and his allies want to destroy the judiciary, turn criminals into victims, and weaken the law." The attack was direct. Michael Carter was the system's #1 enemy, and Graves was smarter and more strategic than anyone he had faced before. The dirty coup. Graves knew that in order to pass the new law, he needed to discredit Michael once and for all. So he plotted the dirtiest coup of all. Days before the vote on the bill, Michael was formally charged with conspiracy against the government. The FBI received a dossier with supposed evidence that Michael was involved in a criminal organization that manipulated sentences and controlled judges. It was a setup, of course, but Graves controlled the right pieces within the system, and now Michael faced possible imprisonment. It was a fatal blow. But Michael was not a man who accepted losing easily. Michael Carter's counterattack. When he learned of the charges, Michael didn't run, he didn't hide, he didn't beg for mercy. He went to Congress and asked to be heard publicly. It was a risky move. If Graves tried to stop him, it would be clear that he was trying to manipulate the system. The hearing was broadcast live to millions of people. Michael went up to the pulpit and looked down at the politicians who wanted to destroy him. Then he said, "Today, I'm here to be accused of a crime I didn't commit. But in fact, the real crime is being committed in front of all of you." Silence filled the room. Senator Graves wants to pass a law that will give more power to the corrupt. They want to criminalize those who fight against the system to ensure that no one dares to challenge them anymore. He pointed at Graves. Graves isn't just protecting the corrupt system. He's part of it. The entire Senate was in shock, but Michael didn't stop. He took a USB stick out of his pocket and handed it to the technician in charge of the transmission. The screen behind him lit up with a video. It was a recording of Graves negotiating an illegal deal with Marshal Drake before the former senator's fall. The whole country saw the true face of corruption. Graves tried to react, but no one believed him. At that moment, Michael Carter had won again. The bill was struck down, and Graves, knowing his empire was crumbling, was forced to resign. The world Michael created, with the fall of Graves, the country entered a new era of judicial reform. Michael Carter not only brought down the corrupt system, but helped build a new model of justice based on transparency and a real balance between law and order. He rejected invitations to political office, but accepted a role as a special advisor in reforming the judicial system. Julia became director of the country's largest civil rights organization, and the people who once lived in fear of a corrupt system now had hope. One evening, Michael was in his office when Julia walked in. "You've done it, Carter." He smiled and looked out of the window at the illuminated city. "There's still a lot of work to do." She crossed her arms. "You're never really going to stop, are you?" He laughed. Justice never sleeps, and neither does he. Michael Carter's legacy years later, the name Michael Carter has become a symbol of resistance and justice. His enemies have fallen. The system has changed, but his fight has never ended. Because as he always said, justice is not a destination. It's a never-ending journey, and he would always be there to fight. The past never sleeps. The name Michael Carter has become a symbol of justice and integrity. His work brought down corrupt judges, exposed manipulative senators, and helped reshape the laws that sustained a system of oppression. But he knew that corruption never disappears completely. It only adapts, and years later the past would come back to haunt him. The shadow returns. On a cold winter's morning, Michael received an envelope with no sender in his office. He opened it and found a single piece of paper. An old photo. It was Theodore Lancaster, the corrupt ex-judge that Michael had destroyed years before. But this photo wasn't from an old archive. It was recent. He was loose and alive. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. If Lancaster was back, it meant that someone very powerful was working in the shadows. The secret plan Michael and Julia began to investigate. It was then that they discovered the truth. Lancaster had not only been secretly released, but was working with a powerful new group within the government, and they had a single goal: to destroy Michael Carter. The attack on Michael. Days later, Michael was attacked. Two hooded men tried to pick him up in a parking lot, but this time he was prepared. Michael reacted, knocking one of the men to the ground and managing to escape. When he analyzed the security cameras, he saw something that left him speechless. One of the assailants was a former FBI agent. This was no ordinary crime. His was an orchestrated hit from inside the system, and he needed to find out who was behind it. The final revelation. After weeks of investigating, Michael and Julia finally found the answer, and it was in a place where he least expected it: the ringleader. Behind the conspiracy wasn't just a politician or a corrupt judge. It was someone who had been watching their every move for years, and this someone left a note on their desk the day before the truth was revealed. On the paper, there was just one sentence: "Did you think you'd won? I was waiting for you to make a mistake." Michael Carter had never been so close to danger, and now he knew he was about to face the deadliest enemy of all. The system's revenge. Michael Carter knew that the past always found a way to come back. The system he had helped dismantle had spent years rebuilding itself in the shadows, and now it was ready to strike back. Theodore Lancaster's return was no coincidence. It was a warning, and the mysterious note that appeared on his desk confirmed his suspicions. He hadn't won outright. He had only bought time. Inspired by classics like The Count of Monte Cristo, Michael knew he was dealing with a patient enemy, someone who had waited in the dark for the right moment to take revenge. And now that moment had arrived. The enemy in the shadows. After weeks of investigation, Michael and Julia discovered that someone inside the government was manipulating behind the scenes. They called themselves the Order of Supreme Justice, a group of judges, prosecutors, and politicians who believed that Michael Carter was a threat to the balance of the country. But the most frightening discovery was this: the leader of the order was someone Michael knew, and he was closer than Michael could have imagined. The betrayal. One silent night, Michael received an unexpected phone call. It was an old ally. "Carter, we need to talk." They arranged to meet in a remote shed. When Michael arrived, he saw the face of betrayal. The man he had trusted for years was involved in the conspiracy. "You always thought you could change everything, Carter," said the traitor, a cold smile on his lips. "But the system doesn't change. It adapts." Michael felt anger boil up in his chest. "You were on our side. You helped to bring down Lancaster to end the Calloway Empire." The traitor sighed. "And that's exactly why I realized that you're the real problem." Michael clenched his fists. "You're making a mistake." The man smiled. "No, Carter, it was your mistake. You thought you could destroy a system built centuries ago." And then the lights in the shed went out. Michael was surrounded, and for the first time in a long time, he had nowhere to run. The capture of Michael Carter. The attack was swift. Masked men emerged from the shadows, and Michael tried to fight back, but it was too many against one. Before he blacked out, he heard the last words of his betrayer. "The world no longer needs you, Carter." And then silence took over. The final conspiracy. Michael woke up in a dark, damp cell. But this was no ordinary prison. He had been taken to a place off the radar where no one could find him. The order had succeeded. They didn't need to kill him. They just needed to erase him from history. Without Michael Carter, justice would return to the hands of the corrupt. Without Michael Carter, the system would go back to working as it always had. But they forgot one detail. Michael Carter never accepted losing, and he always found a way to fight back. The man who wouldn't take silence. "Freedom is too little. What I desire has no name yet." Clarice Lispector. Michael Carter opened his eyes. The smell of mold permeated his nostrils, and the dim light flickered on the cracked ceiling. His hands were shackled to a cold metal table, and the distant sound of dripping broke the dense silence. He blinked, trying to remember how he had got there. The last thing he remembered was betrayal. The face of a man he had once called an ally, telling him that the system would never change, only adapt. Michael Carter was missing, and that meant that for the world he was dead. But what is truly immoral is to have given up on yourself. Michael never gave up, and the system was about to realize the mistake it had made by not killing him. The orders. Plan. Michael knew that they hadn't simply decided to arrest him. They wanted something. "Carter." A voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up. Before him, sitting elegantly in a leather chair, was Theodore Lancaster. The former judge whom he had helped destroy years ago was now watching him with a cutting smile. "I warned you that the system always finds a way to correct itself." Michael didn't reply. Lancaster leaned forward. "You've always been a smart man, Carter, and that's exactly why I'm here to give you a chance." Michael narrowed his eyes. "Chance," Lancaster smiled. "Work with us." The silence was so deep that Michael almost felt his heart stop. "You want me to join you?" Lancaster laughed. "You know more than anyone that this fight will never end. The system will always exist. There will always be a food chain, Carter. And there will always be a top." Michael held his breath. "So what do you want that I become part of it?" Lancaster nodded. "Accept your nature. You can't save everyone, but you can save yourself. As long as I have questions, and there are no answers, I'll keep writing." Michael Carter was made up of questions, and the only answer that mattered he already knew. He would never be part of it. He would never bow down. Michael smiled. "Lancaster, you've never understood me, have you?" The ex-judge frowned. Michael leaned forward and whispered, "I am the error of the system." And then he broke the handcuffs. The impossible escape. The chaos exploded. Michael fought off the guards using the force of adrenaline and desperation to disarm the first man who advanced against him. He grabbed a gun, knocked out 2 other guards, and ran through the dark corridors. He didn't know where he was, but he knew he had to get out of there. What we truly are is what the impossible creates in us, and Michael Carter always turned the impossible into reality. Running through the corridors, he found a locked metal door. He grabbed the gun and shot the electrical panel. The system flashed. The lights went out and then the door opened. The shocking truth: Michael stepped out of the building and stopped. His heart almost stopped when he saw where he was. He expected to be in a secret underground prison. But he wasn't. He was in the heart of Washington, D.C. The order wasn't hidden. It operated openly within the government itself. Michael Carter had just escaped from the most powerful enemy he had ever faced. Destiny is a matter of choice, and now he had a choice to make. Escape, or bring down the system from within. He already knew the answer. He always knew. Michael Carter never ran away, and now he was about to take down the order once and for all. The enemy. Within, Michael Carter walked through the dark night of Washington, D.C. without looking back. The cold wind cut through his skin as he absorbed the shocking revelation. The Order of Supreme Justice was not a group operating in the shadows as he had imagined. They were at the heart of power, and now he knew it. They had made a mistake by not killing him, and he would use that mistake to destroy them. Because there is a right to scream, so I scream. Clarice Lispector, Michael Carter was about to make the biggest scream of his life echo around the world. The hunt begins. That same night, Julia received an email with no sender. Subject: he's alive. When she opened the message, she saw a short video of Michael running through the streets of Washington. She put her hand to her mouth in shock. My God, he's gone. She picked up the phone and immediately called her most trusted contacts. We need a safe house. Now Michael was alive, but now he was the most wanted man in the country, the most dangerous target. The next morning, the news exploded. Michael Carter, missing for weeks, mysteriously reappears. Most dangerous man in America. FBI intensifies search for Michael Carter, traitor or hero. The enigma behind Carter's escape. The newspapers controlled by the Order were already trying to tarnish his image, that he was conspiring against the government. Michael knew he had to act before their narrative destroyed him. But how to fight an enemy that controls the media, the government, and the law? The answer came from where he least expected it. The unlikely alliance. You're crazy if you think you can take down the Order on your own. Michael looked at the man in front of him. It was Dwayne Frazier, an investigative journalist known for challenging power and exposing dangerous truths. Michael had never fully trusted journalists, but he needed someone capable of showing the world what he had discovered. If you want my help, you're going to have to give me something I can publish, said Frazier. Something real. Michael took a deep breath. He had something. The Order operated from inside the government, and he knew where their secret files were. He needed to break into that building, and that meant he was about to commit the biggest crime of his life, the break-in. The next night, Michael and Julia prepared themselves. They studied the Justice Department building for hours. This was where the documents that proved the existence of the Order were. If they managed to expose them, the whole world would know the truth, but the security was intense, insurmountable. Michael knew that if he was caught, he would never get out alive, but he had no choice. I can only meditate until everything falls silent. And so he acted. He and Julia entered through the back door wearing fake badges. Every step was a risk, every second a chance of failure. But then they reached the secret file room. Michael opened the central computer, and what he found made him hold his breath. There were names: politicians, judges, FBI officials, senators, all members of the Order. But the biggest revelation lay in one name at the top of the list, the name of the President of the United States. Michael felt his blood run cold. They weren't just in the government. They were the government, and now he had the evidence to expose it. The revelation to the world. The next morning, Michael and Frazier released the files. The internet exploded. The headlines changed. The Order of Supreme Justice, a conspiracy within the government. Michael Carter proves the existence of the biggest corruption scheme in US history. Is the president involved? The country stopped. The Order tried to defend itself, but it was too late. Michael Carter had brought down the greatest power structure ever created. And now he had to survive the counterattack, because they would come after him. I'm afraid, yes, but fear is the opposite of desire. Michael Carter had no time for fear. He had a country to save. The system's last blow. Michael Carter had done the unthinkable. He not only survived a corrupt system that tried to destroy him, he exposed it in front of the whole world. The release of the documents caused an unprecedented political earthquake. For the first time, the US presidency was directly linked to a conspiracy to manipulate justice, fabricate convictions, and keep power in the hands of a corrupt elite. The country was divided. Millions took to the streets calling for the president's resignation. Politicians tried to distance themselves from the scandal, but there was one thing Michael knew very well. The system never goes down without a fight. And now he was about to face the biggest one of all. The order's reaction. The day after the revelation, Michael and Julia were in hiding following the developments on TV. Then came the news they had been dreading. Arrest warrant issued for Michael Carter for crimes against national security. Michael Carter was now officially a fugitive. "It was expected," said Julia. Michael nodded. "The only way to bring them down completely is to face it head-on." "Do you want to turn yourself in?" she asked, shocked. Michael took a deep breath. "I want to force them to make a fatal mistake." Michael's plan. Michael knew that if he was captured, he wouldn't get a fair trial. The order controlled the government, the courts, and the security forces. But he also knew that their power was weakened. And if he played it right, he could end it all at once. So he set up his own trial. With the help of independent journalists and activists, Michael organized a live broadcast, challenging the president and the entire order to a public debate. "If I'm a criminal, let me prove my innocence in front of the whole country." The video went viral in minutes. The pressure became unbearable, and the government had no choice but to acquiesce. The trial of the century. 2 weeks later, Michael Carter was sitting in front of Congress, live for billions of people around the world. The judge in charge of the case was an ally of the order, and everyone knew that the verdict had already been decided. But Michael didn't need the legal victory. He needed to expose the dirty game in front of everyone. "The government accuses me of crimes against the state," said Michael. "But I ask you, which is more criminal?" The prosecutor tried to discredit him. "You acted outside the law, Mr. Carter." Michael smiled. "Yes, because the law was being used as a weapon against innocent people." He looked directly at the judge. "And if you convict me today, you'll only be proving what everyone already knows." The broadcast erupted in engagement. Politicians tried to remain neutral. But then one of the government's allies made a fatal mistake. He ordered the removal of Michael Carter from the courtroom, on national television, with millions watching. Democracy died live, and at that moment, the US government lost its last drop of credibility. The fall of order. From that moment on, the resistance became uncontrollable. The population took to the streets en masse. Politicians broke with the administration to save their own skins. The president resigned 2 days later. The order tried to fight back, but it was finished. In less than a month, the entire system that had tried to destroy Michael Carter collapsed, and the man who had once been a simple lawyer became the symbol of the greatest legal revolution in history. The future. He built years later. The world was different. Michael Carter did not hold political office. He knew that absolute power always corrupts. Instead, he became a guardian of justice, dedicating his life to ensuring that what happened would never happen again. Julia founded the largest civil rights organization in history, and people finally understood that justice was not an abstract concept. It was a constant struggle, a struggle that Michael Carter would never abandon. And when he was asked years later, "Don't you get tired?" he just smiled and replied, "Justice never sleeps. So I don't either." The legacy of a revolutionary. Michael Carter won. But the struggle never really ends. The government has fallen. The order was exposed and destroyed. Michael Carter's name became a symbol of resistance and justice, echoing in history, books, and being studied in universities around the world. But he knew that victory was never permanent. The system would always try to rebuild itself. Corruption didn't disappear, it transformed itself. And that's why Michael would never rest. Because there is a right to scream. So I scream. Years after the fall of the order, Michael received an unexpected phone call. It was from a voice he hadn't heard for a long time. "Carter," said the voice. Michael frowned. "Lancaster." There was a silence. Then the former judge's deep, aged voice sounded again. "Did you think it was all over?" Michael felt the weight of the past resurfacing. "If you're alive, it means there's still something to be destroyed." Michael replied, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "You always like to play the hero," Lancaster said. "But tell me, Carter, what if you were wrong?" Michael remained silent, and then Lancaster laughed softly. "There's something you don't know yet, something they've kept even from you." Michael felt his heart race. "I'm listening." "Not over the phone," Lancaster replied. "We'll meet tomorrow. One last game, Carter, one last secret." And then the call dropped. Michael took a deep breath. He knew it wasn't over yet, and that the final game was about to begin. Michael Carter's last game. Michael Carter thought it was all over. That the order had been dismantled. That those responsible for the biggest corruption scheme in history had been brought down. But Theodore Lancaster was still alive. And if the corrupt ex-judge he destroyed years ago had anything to say, it meant that history had not yet been completely written. Michael Carter was not a man who ignored the past, and now the past was calling him to one last game. What we truly are is what the impossible creates in us. Clarice Lispector, and Michael was about to face the impossible once again. The meeting Michael went to an abandoned building in downtown Washington, D.C., where Lancaster had arranged the meeting. Julia tried to stop him. "You know this could be a trap." "Of course I know," Michael replied, adjusting his jacket. "So why go?" Michael stopped and looked at her. "Because if there's something I haven't figured out yet, I need to know." Julia sighed and handed him a small device. "I'm tracking you. If anything goes wrong, I'll go in with a team." Michael smiled in a corner, just like old times. And then he entered the building. The last secret. The interior of the building was dark and silent. The only light came from a broken window, where a figure was sitting in a leather chair watching the city. It was Theodore Lancaster. Michael hadn't seen the former judge for years. The man was older, thinner, but still carried that aura of control. "Carter," said Lancaster without turning around. "Lancaster," replied Michael. The former judge gestured for him to sit down. "Thank you for coming." Michael crossed his arms. "Save the theater." "What do you have to tell me?" Lancaster smiled. "You've always been impatient." Michael didn't answer. The ex-judge took a deep breath and finally turned to him. "What you destroyed, the order, was only part of the problem." Michael narrowed his eyes. "Go on." Lancaster picked up a brown envelope and slid it across the table. Michael hesitated for a second, then opened it, and saw a series of confidential documents. Each page was a shock. "This can't be real," Michael muttered. Lancaster smiled. "But it is." The documents showed that the order wasn't the real enemy, they were just soldiers. The real power lay in something bigger, older, something that had been running the country for longer than anyone had imagined. Michael looked at Lancaster. The order lost. He leaned forward. But they didn't. Michael felt a chill. "Who is?" They Lancaster stared at him for a moment and then said, "The Circle." The true conspiracy. Michael didn't blink. He flipped through the documents. The names there weren't just corrupt judges or manipulative politicians. They were leaders of corporations, media magnates, international bankers, the men and women who really controlled the world. "The order was just an experiment, Carter," Lancaster said. "They wanted to test how far they could go without the public reacting." Michael felt his stomach turn. He had spent years thinking that the order was the top of the pyramid, but they had never been the real bosses. And what was worse, they had let Michael Carter bring down the order on purpose, because now he was exactly where they wanted him to be. The real enemy reveals himself. Michael took a deep breath. "And why tell me this?" Lancaster gave a small smile. "Because I want to see what you're going to do now." Michael stood up slowly. He looked at the documents one last time and then said, "I'm going to take them down." Lancaster let out a tired laugh. "Good luck, Carter. They're unlike anything you've ever faced." Michael didn't smile. He just walked to the door and left. The night was cold. Julia was waiting outside. "What did he say?" Michael handed her the documents. She flipped through them quickly. Her face went pale. My God. Michael looked at the horizon where the lights of the city shone brightly. They think they've won. Julia stared at him. Have they? Michael took a deep breath. Not yet. Justice never sleeps. So neither do I. And now Michael Carter was going after the real enemy. The end game had begun. The hunt. Begins. Michael Carter knew that the order was just a test. Now he faced the Circle, a group so powerful that it operated beyond politics, justice, and the media. They controlled everything from the world's biggest companies to the most subtle decisions within the government. And the worst part, Michael had never been so alone. As long as I have questions, and there are no answers, I will keep writing. Clarice Lispector and Michael would keep fighting, because if no one else had the courage to stand up to them, he would. The first clue, with the documents Lancaster handed over, Michael and Julia spent days analyzing every name, every transaction, and every detail. They operate in a completely decentralized way, said Julia. There's no single leader, there are several. Michael looked at the wall full of notes and photos. Among all the connections, one name stood out: Alexander Kane, a billionaire from the technology sector. A man who never appeared directly in the news, but whose companies were involved in practically every economic decision in the country. He was the first piece of the puzzle. If we want to bring down the Circle, we have to start with him, said Michael. Julia crossed her arms. You want to go after the richest and most powerful man in the world? Michael smiled wryly. I've already brought down a government. What's a billionaire compared to that? The infiltration Alexander Kane was untouchable in his fortress. His company, Kane International, operated in a way that was completely shielded from outside investigation. But Michael wasn't just anyone, and he wasn't going to wait for justice. He was going to take matters into his own hands. The following night, Michael and Julia broke into one of Kane's data centers in New York. The mission was simple: access the internal files and find out what was really funding the Circle. But nothing is ever that simple. As soon as Michael entered the building, the alarm went off. They know we're here, Julia whispered into the earpiece. Michael didn't hesitate. He ran through the corridors, disabling cameras, avoiding guards, and finally reaching the main server room. With a small device, he downloaded as much data as possible. But then a voice came over the speakers. Michael Carter. I knew you'd come. Michael froze. It was Alexander Kane. Did you think you could take me by surprise? Kane said with a tone of amusement. We've been watching you for a long time. Michael looked at the cameras. Then why didn't you stop me? The silence was heavy. Then Kane laughed. Because you're exactly where we want you to be. Michael felt an icy chill run down his spine. He had walked into a trap. The Circle's counterattack before he could react. The doors to the room locked automatically. Red lights flashed. He was trapped. Outside, armed guards surrounded the building. Julia tried desperately to hack the system to open the doors, but Kane was always one step ahead. You think you're special, Carter? Kane continued. You think you can change the world, he said, his voice turning colder. But the world was decided a long time ago. Michael knew he had only a few seconds, and then he took a small explosive from his pocket. Kane. Yes, Carter. Michael smiled. I broke your game. He threw the explosive at the main server. The whole room exploded in sparks and smoke, and Michael ran. The impossible escape. In the middle of the confusion, Michael knocked down one of the guards and grabbed his gun. Julia finally managed to unlock some doors. Ormond Carter Michael ran like never before, dodging bullets and knocking down anyone who tried to stop him. When he finally left the building, a car was already waiting for him. He jumped in, and Julia sped off. Behind them, Kane's security forces weren't chasing them. They didn't need to, because Kane wasn't worried, and that scared Michael more than anything else. The darkest revelation: when they finally reached the safe house, Michael and Julia analyzed the data they had managed to save, and what they found left them speechless. The Circle didn't just control the government. They controlled wars, financial markets, communication networks, and even the private data of billions of people. They didn't just manipulate governments, they created and destroyed countries according to their interests. And then Julia looked at Michael and said, "This isn't a game, Carter." Michael closed his eyes for a second. "I know." She swallowed dryly. "So, What are we going to do? Michael opened his eyes, and for the first time he knew he was facing something that might be too big even for him. But that didn't mean he would stop. He never would. Freedom isn't enough. What I desire has no name yet. And now Michael Carter was going to give that desire a name. The circle would fall, or he would die trying. The truth behind the veil. Michael Carter knew he was dealing with something much bigger than anything he had ever faced. The circle wasn't just a group of corrupt powermongers. They were the hidden structure that had always existed, operating on the fringes of history, deciding which wars would be fought, which economies would collapse, and even which leaders would rule. Now he knew too much, and that meant there was no turning back. The question wasn't if they would come after him, it was when. He looked at Julia, who was still analyzing the encrypted data. "We have to act fast," she murmured. "What we've found here. If we leak it the wrong way, they'll bury us before anyone can understand the truth." Michael nodded. He had always known that facing enemies with money and influence was dangerous, but to face an enemy who controlled reality itself, that was suicide. The silent trap. Michael and Julia spent the night dismantling the files they had stolen. They needed to understand how the circle operated and who its true leaders were. But something seemed wrong. The documents contained valuable information, yes, but something essential was missing. "They were missing names. That doesn't make sense," said Julia. "It's as if the information itself is empty." Michael leaned over the monitor, as if they knew we'd be clever enough to get this far. He felt a shiver run down his spine. What if this is part of the plan? Julia stared at him, her eyes wide. Before he could answer, the lights in the safe house flickered. Julia's computer switched itself off. Michael's laptop screen went black, and then a message appeared in red, flashing in the dark. "Good trial, Carter. Now it's our turn." The blackout, the building shook. An explosion shook the structure, and the glass in the windows shattered. Michael grabbed Julia and threw himself behind the desk, protecting himself from the shrapnel. "We're compromised," she shouted, trying to recover the system. But there was no more system. The files were gone. Michael felt a cold chill in his stomach. They had erased everything: his name, his bank accounts, his connections. Nothing existed anymore. Michael Carter had just been erased from the world, escaping death. The door to the safe house was broken down. Heavy footsteps echoed through the destroyed building. They came too fast. Michael knew in that instant that the circle had never intended to stop him from finding those files. They wanted him to get them so they could track his every move. And now they were here to finish the job. Michael pulled Julia by the arm and ran down the narrow corridor. The first shots exploded off the walls, resounding like muffled thunder. Julia ducked, pulling a small device from her pocket. "There," she shouted, throwing the device against the building's gas system. Michael understood the plan in an instant. He drew his gun and shot the device. A wave of white smoke filled the space in seconds, covering them. "This way," Julia shouted, pulling him towards a backfire escape. They fell into the dark alley, the cold, damp air beating against their faces. Michael looked back and saw shadows moving in the mist. The circle's agents were looking for them. They didn't have much time. The escape into the unknown. Michael and Julia knew that staying in the city was suicide. They had to disappear before the circle found them again. In a matter of hours, their faces were on every screen. Fake news spread around the world. Michael Carter, fugitive terrorist, wanted internationally. Former lawyer is suspected of global conspiracy against the world economy. Michael no longer existed. He was now a ghost. He turned to Julia. "We can't trust anyone anymore." She took a deep breath. "So how do we win?" Michael looked up at the dark Washington sky and said just one word: from the inside. The infiltration of the circle. Michael knew he couldn't defeat them from the outside. They controlled the government, the media, the banks. They erased people from existence as if they were just files on a computer. But they had a weakness: ego. Men like Alexander Kane believed they were gods. They believed no one could fool them. So Michael made the most dangerous decision of his life. He wouldn't run away. He would infiltrate. He would become one of them, and then he would destroy the circle from within. Freedom is not enough. What I want has no name yet, but Michael Carter would name it. He would make them remember his name for the rest of history. The most dangerous game. Michael Carter didn't run away. He disappeared. The media still painted him as an international terrorist, but no one knew where he was. No camera could capture him. No digital signal could locate him. To the world, Michael Carter was a dead man, and that was exactly what he wanted, because to bring down the circle he needed to be a ghost. As long as there is life, there is danger. Clarice Lispector, and Michael Carter has always lived in danger. The first step into the abyss, Julia didn't agree with the plan. You're playing with fire, Carter. They're not like the others. There's no scandal to destroy them. There's no court that will judge them. Michael just smiled. So I'm not going to try to expose them. Julia frowned. What do you mean? Michael took a deep breath. I'm going to become one of them. The shock on Julia's face was evident. Are you going to join the circle? Michael nodded. Yes, I'm going to join. And when I'm inside, I'm going to break them from the inside out. Julia hesitated. You know what that means, right? They don't trust anyone. They'll test you every way they can. Michael knew this. He wouldn't just play their game. He would change it. The journey to the center of power. Michael Carter needed a new face, a new name, a new identity. He was no longer Michael Carter, the revolutionary lawyer. He needed to become someone the circle respected. And for that, he would need a godfather. The return to the past Michael went to a man he hated deeply. Theodore Lancaster. The corrupt ex-judge, who had once tried to destroy him, was now his only chance to infiltrate. He found Lancaster in a luxury hotel, where the man still lived like a king despite his destroyed reputation. The ex-judge smiled when he saw him. I knew you'd come back, Carter. Michael sat down at the table, staring at him coldly. I need a favor. Lancaster laughed. That's unheard of, Michael Carter. Asking me for a favor. Michael didn't flinch. You told me you wanted to see what I would do with what I found. Now you're going to see. Lancaster looked at him for a moment. You want to join the circle? Yes. Lancaster picked up a glass of whiskey and took a sip thoughtfully. What if I told you that you had no idea what you were doing? Michael leaned forward. What if I told you that I did? The former judge smiled. In that case, we're going to hell together. The first test in order to infiltrate the circle, Michael, had to be tested. Lancaster organized a secret meeting with one of the organization's intermediaries, a man called Adrian West. He was one of the people responsible for selecting those worthy of joining the inner circle. Michael arrived at the meeting place wearing a new face, a new identity. He was now Lucas Hayes, an ex-investor who wanted to expand his influence behind the scenes of power. West watched him for long seconds. Lancaster told me that you have talent. Michael smiled. I have much more than that. West tilted his head. And how do I know that you're not just another one who wants to join to play at power? Michael didn't hesitate. Test me, the middleman smiled. So, Mr. Hayes, tell me, what are you willing to sacrifice to be a part of this? Michael kept his expression firm. Everything. West picked up a small black card and slid it across the table. Then prove it. On the card, there was an address and a time. Michael knew that this was his first test, and he also knew that if he failed, he would never get out alive. The road to darkness. That night, Michael arrived at the address indicated. It was a private club, one of the places where the true masters of the world met unseen. West was waiting at the entrance. From here, there's no turning back. Michael looked around. He wasn't there to turn back. Let's get started. And so he entered. At the same moment, he felt the weight of the elite watching him. The final game had begun. And Michael Carter was betting his very soul. Michael Carter's last game. Michael Carter knew there was no turning back. He entered the circle not as a man, but as a shadow, a ghost who would dismantle the system from within. From day one, he realized that power here was not like in politics, nor like in organized crime. The circle didn't need to threaten anyone. They didn't need to raise their voices. They just decided what would happen in the world. And the world obeyed. Freedom is not enough. What I desire has no name yet. Clarice Lispector. Michael was going to give it a name. He was going to destroy the circle from the inside out. The true test Michael spent months building his reputation within the circle. He showed intelligent strategy and, above all, feigned absolute loyalty. Until finally he was called to a meeting with Alexander Kane. The billionaire looked at him with interest. "You've moved up fast, Lucas Hayes," Michael smiled. "When you know how the game is played, everything gets easier." Kane raised a glass of wine. "So tell me, are you ready to be part of something bigger than anything you've ever imagined?" Michael held up his own glass and asked the final question. "I am. But first tell me, what does the circle fear?" The room fell silent. Kane laughed softly. "The circle fears nothing, Mr. Hayes." Michael tilted his head. "Then why am I here?" The billionaire stopped laughing. For a second, Michael saw a glimmer of something in his eyes. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something like fear. The last blow. Michael waited weeks for the right moment, and then he found the flaw. The circle thought it was invincible, but every empire has a weakness, and theirs was arrogance itself. Michael gained access to confidential files containing the entire hidden structure of the organization, transactions, documents, recorded confessions. The circle never imagined that someone on the inside could betray them, and Michael Carter was betrayal in the form of a man. He sent the files to journalists around the world, to independent governments, to international organizations. In a matter of hours, the truth exploded. The circle could no longer hide. The world finally knew who really ruled behind the scenes. And then, the circle crumbled. But Michael knew it wouldn't end that way, because they would come after him. The last meeting, Alexander Kane didn't run away. He waited. Michael entered the penthouse where Kane was, knowing that this would be the end of the journey. The billionaire was sitting in front of the window, looking out over the city. He didn't look worried. He didn't look defeated. He just smiled. "You won, Carter." Michael Carter didn't smile back. It's not about winning or losing. Kane turned the glass of whiskey in his hand. "Funny." "I guess so." Michael walked over to him. "The circle is over. The world knows the truth." The billionaire sighed. "Yes. But tell me, Carter, what now?" Michael frowned. "Now the world is free." Kane laughed for real this time. "Free? You think there's such a thing as freedom?" He pointed to the city outside. "You can destroy us, but then what? Who will rule? Who's going to make the decisions that no one wants to make?" Michael knew that Kane was playing with his mind, but he also knew that deep down there was a dangerous truth in what he was saying, because the circle wasn't created out of nothing. It existed because the world needed control. Kane stood up, holding out his glass. He took a sip, looked at Michael, and then he fell dead to the floor. Michael didn't move. He already knew. Alexander Kane wouldn't allow himself to be captured. He killed himself. The last leader of the circle had fallen. But the game wasn't over. The silence after the storm. Days later, Michael Carter disappeared. The world still talked about him. Some called him a hero, others called him a traitor. But the truth, no one knew where he was. Only Julia did. She walked into a discreet apartment away from the spotlight and found Michael staring at the sea in silence. He didn't turn to face her. "What next?" she asked. Michael took a deep breath and replied, Now the world decides." Julia was silent. Then she smiled. Because for the first time, Michael Carter had no more enemies. The game was finally over, and he was still standing.